Let's talk about fingering the guard again, but also in this case with Indian swords. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, I've talked quite a bit in the past about fingering the guard. What does that mean? For anyone who hasn't seen my previous videos, very, very briefly, it just means putting the index finger over the front of the guard. Why would you do this? I hear people cry. Well, quite simply for more control, okay, in a nutshell. Some people would say it brings the blade more in line with the forearm, it makes thrusting easier. There are other things as well. It gives you a little bit of extra leverage on the grip, so you can do quicker kind of snap cuts and change direction and things like this. Also, if you're wearing certain types of gauntlet, it means that the sword can sit in the hand at a better angle. When you don't have an enormous amount of articulation in the wrist, it actually helps. So if you could only go that far forward with your gauntlet, by doing this, you can now get the blade further forward with the gauntleted hand on, which makes certain types of thrusts more easy and means you can reach a bit further with your cuts. And there's a bunch of other reasons. Incidentally, if you get anyone who does HEMA or any kind of swordsmanship or reenactment maybe even as well, if you're using a sword a lot for a protracted amount of time, your hand starts to get tired and starts to slip down. It's a way of anchoring your hand up there as well. So there are various reasons why you might want to finger the guard, so to speak. But there is an obvious drawback to this, which everybody pretty much can immediately see and often points out on videos, and that is that it exposes your beloved index finger over the front of the guard. And indeed, with blades, they do tend to slide down each other, and you know that's why you've got a cross guard there on lots of types, most types of sword in fact. So putting your finger in front there and running the risk of losing your finger quite easily. I mean, if a blade slides down there, it's not going to take an awful lot of force to at least incapacitate that finger and possibly just take it clean off. This incidentally is why already in the early 15th century, particularly in the sort of 1420s, 30s, we start to see what's called a finger ring develop here, which I've talked about in loads of videos in the past. Ultimately, that finger ring gets another partner at the back, so you get a pair of finger rings, and it's the beginning of the developed hilt, as we call it, that perhaps becomes most famously in the 16th century, so after the year 1500, but they did certainly appear before that, and we can see finger rings appearing already in the 1420s and 30s, and paired finger rings not soon after, by about the 1450s. By the 1470s, you basically already have the fully developed, what we'd commonly call a side sword hilt, although that's a problematic term, but nevertheless, you get the idea. So indeed, the hilt develops to protect the finger because people wanted to put the finger over the cross guard. Now, what I want to switch to now is Indian swords. So I've spent a lot of time in the past, in fact I'll put that one down because it's sharp and I don't like having it on my lap. I've spent a lot of time in the past talking about Indian sword hilts and how the disc pommel encourages you, I won't say forces, but encourages you to hold it in a certain way and to cut in a certain way, not extending the wrist forward, blah, blah, blah. So there is a way of cutting, or at least there is one way of cutting in Indian swordsmanship, which definitely seems connected to the fact that we have these disc pommels. And these disc pommels were exceedingly popular in India after, well, from the 16th century onwards, and then by the 18th century they were just completely the standard Indian sword. So clearly they tied in very well with the systems of swordsmanship used in India, and I've spoken quite a bit about grip, or rather hilt form, encouraging that form of cutting, and cutting using the elbow and the shoulder instead of the cutting from the wrist rotation. But in addition, I've talked about hilt size in my last video on the topic, in fact, and how the size of the hilt, therefore, because it's so critical to this type of sword, really must fit your hand, and if it's a bit too small, you kind of can't use it properly. And additionally, I've also talked about the form of these pommels and the fact that this one, you'll see it curves away from the hand, so it actually makes it more comfortable and easier to use for most people with a large-ish hand, rather than the flat disc pommels, unless the hilt is really big enough to accommodate your hand. And additionally, I've probably mentioned in the past, so I can't remember clearly, these discs are often tilted. You'll notice that this is not in a straight line with the hilt, it's actually tilted away at the back. Now, all of those things being said, and there's tons and tons you can say about Indian swords, swordsmanship, hilt design, and all of those things. It's a fascinating topic. There's a massive variety of weapons from India, and we know a fair amount about Indian martial arts going back, and some of them have surviving lineages, and so that it's a massive, massive topic. But whenever I talk about Indian swordsmanship, something that comes up, you can see where I'm going here, something that comes up which I've never really directly addressed before, and that is fingering the guard. Now, I'm aware that there are some modern schools of Indian swordsmanship that say that you shouldn't put all of your fingers inside the hilt. Well, first of all, looking at Indian art, I don't agree with that. The fact is that we've actually got tons and tons of Indian art. We've got manuscripts, we've got paintings, we've got statues, we've got friezes, we've got wood carvings, we've got all kinds of stuff which show people holding swords. And the simple fact is that statistically, we can see that most Indian swords were gripped like this. Okay, now, that being said, that's not the only way to grip a sword, just the same as it wouldn't be in Europe. Okay, so we look at European sources and we can see, if I go back to the arming sword quickly again, we can see that there are all sorts of different ways of gripping a sword. Sometimes people grip it down by the pommel. In the case of earlier sort of Viking era swords, right the way down close to the pommel, so you can actually see a visible gap at the top of the hand. Sometimes people hold it at the top of the grip with a visible gap at the bottom of the hand. Sometimes they hold it in a very sloped grip. Sometimes they put the thumb up the back, like with the sabre. We certainly see this with the Langmesser and the Dussac. So thumb up grip isn't only a 18th, 19th century thing that you get with sabres, it's absolutely something you already get, at least in the 15th century, with regularity. And people like Roland Vorcheka have shown that you can see things like this in way earlier periods as well, in the Viking and kind of Frankish and Anglo-Saxon eras. Then we've got the fingering of the guard, but there are other options. Now, what people point out about Indian swordsmanship is they sometimes make a categorical statement whereby they go, Matt, you shouldn't grip it like that. Well, as I've said, if you look at all the Indian art, that's how most people are shown gripping a sword in Indian art, is what we call a hammer fist. But yes, indeed, sometimes the lead finger, just as in European art, is shown doing other things. And one of those things is fingering the guard. Now, the question is, why would you want to finger the guard? Well, I would say all the same reasons as European swords, for potentially bringing the point more online, potentially a little bit more control, perhaps to prevent your hand getting tired. But there's one other really important reason that comes up related to these pommels, and this isn't an issue that we really have with European sword pommels for the most part. So with a disc pommel, say for example you've inherited your grandfather's sword, but the grip's too small for you, but you really want to use your grandfather's sword because he killed some famous swordsman in a battle 80 years ago, and you want to be just like him. You want to carry his sword, carry on the family tradition, but your hand's too big for the hilt. Well, one way to overcome that is to stick your finger over the guard. So you can hold Indian swords where the hilts are too small for you by sticking your finger over the guard. Now, obviously this comes with all the same drawbacks as with the European sword. Your finger is vulnerable, okay? And I don't think that this was normal, contrary to what some people say. I don't think this was normal because it's not shown in Indian art. I don't know any historical source evidence for this being the case. Equally, some people say that the finger should be placed almost like pointing. So rather than over the guard, it should be pointed almost at what you're aiming at. And again, this is another way of making up for the fact that you've got a small hilt, too small for your hand, I would say. And it achieves, in terms of that, it achieves the same thing as putting your finger over the guard. But here's why I'm not a fan of that. So, to me, laying the finger along the side of the crossguard has all of the disadvantages of fingering the guard because it exposes the finger and makes it very vulnerable. Perhaps arguably because it's not on top of the guard, it's not quite as vulnerable, but it's still pretty vulnerable. But it doesn't have the advantages because what it doesn't do is it doesn't bring the point any more in line with the forearm than putting your finger over does. In fact, putting your finger over does it even more. And additionally, it doesn't give you that anchor and that support. So one of the advantages of putting your finger over a guard is it gives you an extra leverage point to give those snap cuts a bit more power, to keep the sword a little bit more locked into your hand. And if you just lay the finger along the side of the guard, it doesn't achieve either of those things. Debatably, arguably, one of the only advantages putting your finger along the side of the guard has is perhaps aiding your edge alignment. But to be completely honest, I never find any problem with edge alignment with a talwar because of the very distinctive shape of the hilt. It kind of makes edge alignment very difficult to mess up, and it's a curved blade in most cases. So if it's got a curved blade, edge alignment again is assisted by that. So I'm kind of unconvinced. Now, not to say that people never did it. You might be able to find it in some artwork. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've actually seen it on some Middle Eastern, perhaps Persian or Mamluk, I can't remember, artwork, where with a Mamluk hilted shamshir, the finger is laid along like that. There could even be arguments for putting it up here somewhere, but it's not very secure, and you're left with your weaker three fingers at this point holding the hilt, which doesn't seem like a good idea to me. So, to cut a long story short, I think, based on the available evidence, the historical sources available to us, in this case the primary sources being artwork of various sorts, manuscripts, paintings, and sculpture, statues and such like, which sometimes show gods and goddesses wielding swords, they are pretty much always with this hammer fist grip. Sometimes you can find examples maybe of the finger over the guard. Sometimes maybe you can find examples of the finger extended, but I don't think those latter two are normal. I think what's normal, just like with European swords, what's normal is the hammer fist grip. And it is worth noting that a lot of earlier Indian swords, if we go back beyond the 16th century, don't have a cross guard like this. They have actually a form of plate at the top, a basket hilt, where you could never possibly put the finger up there. It's just not an option, it's not possible, and they've still got equally small, tight hilts. In Europe, when we start to see people with any regularity putting the finger over the guard, we start to see finger rings develop, which we don't see at all in India. You do see it, interestingly, in Sri Lanka, but that's because the Sri Lankan castane sword seems to be emulating Portuguese swords that have come in through trade, Portuguese hangers, essentially, falchions. One final thing to mention is, ironically, about the finger, despite the fact that I've just said I don't think that this was a common thing to do in India, Indian swords are peculiarly well suited to fingering the guard because they have what's known as an Indian ricasso, and you'll notice that the edge on Indian swords, not always, but very, very often, only comes down to level with the top languette. Okay, the edge comes down to here, and then there is a plunge grind, there is a shoulder here that is completely blunt. I've got it on this example in here. On all of my tulwars, they've all got this Indian ricasso, as it's commonly known in the sort of collector's world. When you don't have an Indian ricasso, that can be evidence for it being an imported blade, for example, from Syria or Persia, wherever. So when we go to the Middle East, generally the edge goes all the way down to the bottom. Now, what's interesting is European swords, in contrast, certainly medieval European swords, usually don't have a ricasso, but the Type 19, so if you know your oak shot typology, the oak shot Type 19 blade does have a ricasso, and that is the type of blade you very often find coupled with finger rings and the early development of the so-called side sword. So indeed, there does seem to be a correlation between the development of the ricasso and fingering the guard. So from that point of view, if you purely look at the swords, you could say, well, that perhaps is evidence for the fact that people did finger the guard in India because they have this very defined ricasso. And if we look at Europe, that's tied in with fingering the guard. So, two sides of evidence there. So I haven't nailed all of my options to one tree. I've spread my bets. I believe that the conventional way to grip a tulwar throughout the period of the tulwar's use was a hammer fist. But it is possible, as I've pointed out with the ricasso, it is possible that enough people wanted to finger the guard, either because the hilt was too small for them or whatever other reason, that the Indian ricasso was favourable to them. That being said, I don't necessarily think that that's the reason, and I don't necessarily think those two things are connected. I believe that the Indian ricasso is there because of the way that older Indian hilts were attached to the blades, which is riveting through the blade up here. You glue the hilt on and rivet through here, meaning that there are always languettes or forms of projection up here, which prohibit there being an edge at that point. So, an interesting and complicated topic. I hope I've done it service in this video. I hope I've represented it clearly. If you know any more reference points or kind of evidence for this whole question and this debate about whether Indian swords should be fingered at the guard, or whether they were fingered at the guard ever, or sometimes, rarely, or very often, if you know of any evidence whatsoever to support either of those positions or ends of the spectrum or somewhere in the middle or whatever, I am fascinated to see your evidence posted below. So, bits of historical source material, be it art, sculpture, whatever, books, manuscripts. I'd be fascinated to see it. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope this has been interesting for some of you, and I'll see you back on the channel again soon. Cheers, folks.